My father-in-law gave my brother-in-law 3 houses. My husband, Michael, said nothing. The next day, he made 2 decisions. "Dad," he announced, "Sarah and I have been transferred for a new project in Puerto Rico. We leave next week." We had drained our savings to buy a house for his parents. I was choked with resentment as they blatantly stripped it from us to hand to their youngest son. The bitterness was a poison, yet Michael had simply nodded in serene agreement. In the depths of my despair, as I was about to throw divorce papers at him, I discovered that his meekness was a perfectly orchestrated act. It was a flawless trap he had set himself, designed to ensnare his treacherous family and push them into the jaws of bankruptcy and foreclosure. The city of Chicago was settling into the final days of winter. A sweet, sharp cold slipped through every window crack, carrying the dry sting of the lake-effect wind. The handsome 3-story brownstone, tucked away on a wide, tree-lined street in Lincoln Park, was ablaze with light tonight. It was the home of my parents-in-law, Frank and Susan. This weekend dinner was not part of our usual routine. This afternoon, while Michael and I were scrambling to finish a research proposal on new crop genetics at the university's Agricultural Institute, my father-in-law had called abruptly. His voice was stern and final, demanding that we both be present for dinner. He had a matter of great importance to declare. As was my duty as a daughter-in-law, I hastily cleared my desk, rushing to a Whole Foods to buy a beautiful wild-caught salmon, some fresh asparagus, and a prime cut of beef for the meal. In the 5 years since I had married into the Miller family, I had always maintained the role of a proper daughter-in-law, never daring to utter a word against my in-laws. I toiled in the kitchen for 2 solid hours, the smoke from the searing beef stinging my eyes, yet my heart held a quiet hope that this was for a happy announcement. The meal was served impeccably, steam rising invitingly in the cold air. My father-in-law sat at the head of the table, the seat of honor. Frank, now in his 60s, was a retired mid-level government official with an intensely patriarchal nature. My mother-in-law sat beside him, her gaze, as always, fixed on her youngest son seated across from me. Kevin, Michael's younger brother, was 28 but behaved like an overgrown teenager. He changed jobs constantly, one month claiming to be a real estate mogul in the making, the next announcing plans to open a trendy coffee shop. Each venture ended the same way, in failure and a return home, hand outstretched for his parents' money. Even now, with the whole family at the table, Kevin's eyes were glued to his phone, his hand shoveling food into his mouth without a glance at anyone. Frank cleared his throat, setting his glass of whiskey down on the oak table. The clink of glass on wood was sharp and dry. Everyone paused, utensils hovering. I looked at Michael. His face remained calm, his hands resting neatly on the table. Frank slowly swept his gaze over his children before speaking, his voice low and gravelly but filled with authority. He said he had called us here tonight to discuss the division of his assets while he and Susan were still of sound mind, to prevent any future discord between the brothers. The room fell silent. I thought to myself, finally, they're thinking about securing their children's futures. Michael and I were still renting a cramped, run-down 2-bedroom apartment in an old building in Pilsen, less than 800 square feet. If his parents gave us a little capital, we could borrow the rest to buy a small condo, establish our lives, and start planning for a child. But Frank's next words fell like hammer blows on my consciousness. He declared, in a clear voice, that he would be transferring the titles of all 3 of the family's properties to Kevin. 3 properties. One was a retail space they leased out, another was the large Lincoln Park house they lived in, and the third, to my horror and disbelief, was the house that represented my and Michael's entire life's work. I was stunned. A roar filled my ears, and my heart hammered against my ribs as if it would break free. That third house was our sweat and tears, our sleepless nights working on side projects, our dinners of ramen and boiled eggs for years on end. We had emptied every penny from our savings. I had even sold the nest egg my own mother had given me to buy that house. Our original purpose was to provide his parents with a spacious, quiet place to retire in their old age. The deed was in Frank's name. Michael had said it would please his parents, a testament to the devotion of their eldest son. I had trusted my husband, trusted in the bonds of family. The reason Frank gave was laughable. He said Michael and I were both brilliant agricultural scientists, working at a major research institute, with stable salaries and benefits. We could provide for ourselves. Kevin, on the other hand, had an unstable career, his ventures always a gamble, and he was still unmarried. Kevin needed assets, a solid foundation, a respectable home to attract a wife and continue the family line. He even emphasized that as the older siblings, we had a duty to be generous, to yield and provide for our younger brother. That was the proper way of things. My mother-in-law immediately chimed in. She beamed, placing the choicest piece of salmon on Kevin's plate, her voice syrupy sweet. She cooed that Michael and Sarah were reasonable people. They surely wouldn't squabble with their little brother. She insisted that it didn't matter whose name was on the deed. It was all in the family. When Kevin is well off, he'll be the one to take care of us in our old age. Hearing this, Kevin just smirked with satisfaction, not even bothering to offer a word of thanks. I sat there, frozen, unable to believe what I was hearing. The blood in my veins felt like it was boiling. This blatant favoritism had existed since I first married into the family, but I never imagined it could be so shameless, so cruel. The house we had bought with our own hard work was being stolen from us in broad daylight and handed to a lazy freeloader. The atmosphere in the dining room became suffocating. I fought to suppress the wave of outrage rising in my throat, my eyes welling up as I turned a desperate gaze to the man sitting beside me, hoping he would say something, anything, to fight for the small family we had built together. My eyes were fixed on Michael's face. In this moment of profound injustice, I expected my husband to protest, to speak up and defend the fruits of our shared labor. Michael was the eldest son. His voice had always carried weight in the family. If he just spoke up, reminded his parents of the origin of that third house, if he just mentioned that we were still living in a rented apartment, I believed they would have to reconsider, or at least couldn't be so unreasonable. But contrary to the fiery hope burning within me, Michael remained perfectly still. He didn't turn to look at me, completely ignoring the pleading, agonized look from the wife who had stood by his side for 5 years. He calmly picked up his fork, lifted a piece of beef to his mouth, and chewed slowly, as if his father's pronouncement of dispossession was nothing more than idle chatter about the weather. I could hear my own breathing become ragged, time seeming to freeze in the dining room. Each passing second was like a needle prick against my skin. Michael finished his food, set his fork down, and gave a slip. He said that whatever his parents decided, he would accept. As long as they were happy and the family was at peace, that was all that mattered. Kevin's business was his business, too, and he and Sarah had no objections. Michael's words were a bucket of ice water thrown in my face. A sharp pain shot through my chest. This man, the man I called my husband, who had shared my joys and sorrows, had just callously offered up his own wife's hard work to someone else. His initial silence had been terrifying, but his spoken agreement was 1,000 times more brutal. He chose to be the perfectly dutiful son in his parents' eyes, but in doing so, he became a cowardly and irresponsible husband to his own small family. Hearing her eldest son's words, Susan's face lit up. She beamed, her eyes crinkling as she praised Michael endlessly for being such a responsible older brother, for seeing the bigger picture. She told Kevin he must be grateful to his brother and sister-in-law in the future, that he should never forget their sacrifice. At this, Kevin finally looked up from his phone, chewing loudly, and let out a snort. He mumbled something about Michael being loaded and not short on cash. A few houses were nothing to him and Sarah. It was just a little seed money for his next venture. He promised he'd pay them back tenfold when he got rich. The hollow, disingenuous words floating over the dinner table made me sick to my stomach. They were performing a play about a warm, loving family, supporting one another. But in reality, they were parasites, sucking the lifeblood from my husband and me. They knew perfectly well how frugally we lived. Michael was a dedicated researcher, and I spent my days and nights in the lab. Our university salaries were modest. We had to take on countless side projects, staying up late, translating technical papers to earn extra income. The jacket I was wearing was frayed at the cuffs, Michael's shoes were worn down at the heel, all because we were trying to provide for both our families. And what had that sacrifice earned us? Nothing but contempt and blatant exploitation. Michael continued to eat, occasionally serving food to his mother and brother. His composure sent a chill down my spine. I realized a bitter truth. In Michael's mind, his parents and brother were his real family, and I, his lawful wife, was perhaps just a partner to help him earn money to support that larger family unit. He was willing to sacrifice his wife's interests, to trample on her sweat and tears, just to maintain the facade of a dutiful son. Michael's silence and his nod had severed the last thread of hope within me, turning what should have been a warm dinner into a death sentence for the marriage I had worked so hard to build. The dining room now felt like a suffocating prison cell. The clatter of silverware, the cheerful chatter of the other three, all blended into a grating, unbearable noise. They were excitedly discussing what Kevin would do with his 3 new properties. Frank advised him to sell the one they had bought to get the cash to start a distribution company for agricultural supplies, leveraging our connections to get cheap inventory. Susan dismissed that, saying it was better to rent it out for a steady monthly income. What if his business failed again? Every word they spoke treated our property like a prize that had fallen from the sky. I sat like a statue, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. The resentment that had been building for years suddenly boiled over, surging like a furious flood breaking through a dam. I remembered the bone-chilling winter nights when I was sick with a high fever but still had to wrap myself in a blanket and type out translations to meet a deadline. I remembered visiting my own mother, who would see how thin I'd become and press a few $100s into my hand, telling me to buy something nice for myself. I would take that money and buy vitamins for my in-laws. All those images flashed before my eyes, mocking my foolishness and blind tolerance. Kevin glanced over at me, noticing my dark expression, and his tone turned taunting. He smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm, asking what was wrong with his sister-in-law today. Why the long face? Was I upset about giving up the property? As a daughter-in-law of the Miller family, everything I had was the Miller family's property. Why be so petty with my own brother-in-law? Kevin's words were the spark that lit the powder keg. My mother-in-law immediately cleared her throat and shot me a sharp, cutting glare. She said coolly that a person had to know how to be generous. When a woman marries, she joins her husband's family. I shouldn't bring my selfish, individualistic attitude into my dealings with family. This family had never tolerated a daughter-in-law who dared to show displeasure with the parents' decisions. A person's endurance has its limits. I could not tolerate this shameless humiliation for another second. I released my grip on the table, picked up my fork, and slammed it down on my plate. A sharp crack echoed, rattling the porcelain dishes. The chatter instantly ceased. All 4 of them stared at me in shock. Michael frowned, reaching for my hand, but I yanked it away. I shot up from my seat, pushing the chair back with a screech against the tiled floor. I took a deep breath, looking Frank straight in the eye, then shifted my gaze to Susan and Kevin, my voice colder and more resolute than it had ever been. I announced that this dinner was more than enough for me. I was full and would be leaving now. My sudden rebellion sent Frank into a rage, his face turning beet red. He slammed his hand on the table, shot to his feet, and pointed a trembling finger at my face, unleashing a torrent of abuse. He called me an ill-mannered, uneducated daughter-in-law, saying my own mother had failed to teach me any respect, which is why I now dared to show such an attitude to my husband's parents. He roared that the property was in his name, and he had the right to give it to whomever he pleased. I had no standing to express any opinion in this house. My father-in-law's vulgar insults no longer scared or hurt me. My heart had turned to ice. I didn't bother to defend myself or argue back. Arguing with people devoid of reason and fairness would only diminish my own worth. I turned and walked quickly to the coat rack, grabbing my jacket and my worn-out handbag. I didn't look back at Michael, not even once. I opened the door and stepped out into the frigid Chicago night, leaving behind the echoing curses of my father-in-law and the cowardice of the man I once called my husband. The north wind off the lake slapped against my face, but the cold of the weather was nothing compared to the ice encasing my heart. I walked aimlessly down the long, quiet street. The pale yellow light of the street lamps cast my long shadow on the cracked pavement. My feet moved automatically, like a machine, my mind a hollow void filled only with the whistling of the wind and the insults of my in-laws echoing in my ears. Before I reached the end of the block, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. A large hand gripped my arm, pulling me to a stop. It was Michael. His face was pale under the streetlight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled me toward the old sedan parked at the curb, the car we had bought on a payment plan to make our commute to the Research Institute easier. He opened the passenger door, pushed me inside, and quickly circled to the driver's side. The car door slammed shut, trapping us in a small, suffocating space thick with tension. Michael started the engine and turned on the heat. Warm air filled the car but did nothing to dispel the chill between us. He pulled away from the curb, merging into the sparse late-night traffic. For a long stretch, neither of us spoke. The hum of the engine sounded like the choked sobs of a dying marriage. Unable to bear the deadly silence any longer, I turned to face Michael directly. I asked him, my voice choked with emotion but full of fury. Did he still consider me his wife? I demanded to know why. When his parents announced they were stealing the fruits of our labor, he could just sit there eating his dinner and nod in humiliating agreement. Did he realize he was enabling his family's greed, helping them trample on his own wife's sweat and tears? Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He clenched his jaw and spoke in a low, tired voice. He told me not to make a scene. His parents were old. They didn't have much time left. It wasn't worth fighting over. He said giving the assets to Kevin kept it in the family. As the older brother, he couldn't be petty. He had to bear the responsibility of filial duty. He begged me to just endure it for a little while, for the sake of peace in the family. Filial duty? That again? I let out a bitter laugh, tears streaming down my cheeks. I confronted him about his twisted definition of duty. Was it dutiful to let his parents rob his own wife and husband to support a lazy, able-bodied 28-year-old brother? Was it dutiful to let his wife suffer contempt and humiliation from his entire family without uttering a word in her defense? I asked him where his responsibility as a husband was, or was he only capable of being his parents' obedient son? I reminded him of the days when we were dating, when he had promised me the world, sworn he would always protect me from any storm. I had ignored all my friends' warnings about his complicated family, determined to marry him solely because I believed in his character and his love. But tonight, he had shattered that belief with his own hands. He condoned his family's cruel exploitation, turning me into nothing more than a money-making tool. Michael remained silent. His prolonged silence in the cramped car was like a sharp knife, slicing away at my bleeding heart. He had no excuse, nor the courage to face the truth. As we drove down Lakeshore Drive, the city lights flashing past the window, illuminating his angular but soulless face, I turned away. I stared out the window, letting my tears fall silently in the darkness. Michael's silence that night stripped away the last shred of respect I had for him, sending our marriage hurtling over a cliff. The car stopped in front of the old 5-story apartment building in Pilsen, our home for the past 5 years. The yellowed, peeling paint on the walls, the dark, damp concrete stairs reeking of garbage. The shabby scene was a cruel joke next to the massive fortune of 3 valuable houses his parents had just generously bestowed upon their precious youngest son. I got out of the car and hurried up the stairs, leaving Michael to trudge behind with my bag. I unlocked the door and stepped into the 800-square-foot apartment. The familiar smell of mildew hit my nose. The furniture was Spartan, a cheap particle board dining set, an old television, and a corner piled high with agricultural research papers. I dropped my handbag onto the sofa, feeling completely drained of energy. Michael came in, carefully closing the door behind him. He stood there, staring at me, his face a mask of awkwardness and exhaustion. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. The last of my restraint shattered. I jumped to my feet, erupting in a fury I had never shown before. I sobbed, my voice breaking with pain and resentment. I pointed at the shabby furniture, screaming at Michael, asking him if he could see the life we were living. 5 years of marriage, and I hadn't had a single day of comfort. Other women got to buy nice clothes, go on vacations. And me? I wore the same few work outfits I'd had for 3 years. I couldn't afford expensive makeup. I'd come home from work and go straight to the kitchen, then spend my evenings hunched over my laptop, translating documents until my eyes blurred. I listed every dollar we had saved, our holiday bonuses, project commissions, the money from my mother's nest egg, all of it pooled together and given to his parents for every little family expense. The culmination was the enormous sum for that third house. We had eaten ramen for months, scrimped and saved on everything to pay off the loan ahead of schedule. I did all of it because I considered them my family. I wanted to be a good daughter-in-law to make my husband proud. But what did I get in return? They treated me like an outsider, a guest in their home. Even worse, they saw me as a tireless ATM. When they needed money, his parents would call, their voices sweet as honey. Once they had what they wanted, they were ready to cast me aside, taking my sweat and tears to lavish upon a parasite. And the deepest pain didn't come from his family, but from the man who shared my bed. His cowardice and weakness had enabled them to take everything from me. I slammed my hand on the table, tears streaming down my face. I told Michael I was done. I couldn't carry this toxic family for another day. My sacrifice had been rendered meaningless. My love had been brutally trampled upon. I enunciated each word with chilling clarity, telling him that if he chose to be a dutiful son and a great older brother, then he could have his family and live with them. As for me, I was setting him free. I refused to be the Miller family's ATM any longer. The room fell into a terrifying silence, my sobs echoing off the cold walls. I stood there, exhausted and hopeless, awaiting the final end of this tragic marriage. The dam had broken, and nothing could save what was already rotten at the core. I turned away, unwilling to see the belated remorse on the face of the man who had single-handedly destroyed our home. The small living room was submerged in a shattered silence. My ragged breaths after the storm of anger were heavy and labored. I stood in the middle of the room, my eyes stinging, bitter tears still tracing paths down my weary cheeks. All the repression from 5 years as a Miller daughter-in-law, all the humiliation of being treated like a tool, I had thrown it all in Michael's face. I expected him to get angry, to defend his despicable family, as he always did. But no, Michael remained rooted to the spot, his broad shoulders slumped as if under the weight of a mountain. Suddenly, he moved forward. He didn't shout, didn't explain. He bent his knees and knelt on the cold linoleum floor, right in front of me. His unexpected action startled me. I took a step back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. In all the time I had known him, I had never seen this proud man humble himself to such a degree. His large, calloused hands, hardened by years of fieldwork, reached out and clasped my legs. He buried his head against my knees, his hot breath warming the fabric of my pants. He spoke in a choked voice, each word heavy but incredibly firm. He told me to stop crying, that he knew he had wronged me terribly. He said he understood every bit of my frustration, every hardship I had endured for the past 5 years. He hadn't missed a thing. He had seen the nights I stayed up typing until my eyes were raw. It pained him to see me skimp on myself while giving the best to his parents and brother. He accepted all the blame for letting me suffer such profound injustice at dinner tonight. I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet, 100 conflicting emotions swirling within me. His words were sorrowful, but the wound inside me was too deep to be soothed by a few words of apology. I tried to pull his hands away, coldly telling him to stand up, that there was no need for this melodrama between us. I reminded him that he was the one who had nodded in agreement to give the 3 houses to Kevin. He was the one who had trampled on our shared labor. Would kneeling and crying now change that cruel reality? Michael looked up at me. Under the dim fluorescent light, I saw his eyes were bloodshot. His jaw clenched so tight that the muscles stood out. He refused to let go, instead, tightening his grip, his voice now urgent and serious. He begged me to calm down and listen to him. He asked me to trust him one last time, just this once. He swore, enunciating every syllable, that from this moment on, he would never let me suffer any more hardship or injustice from his family. He said he had a way to resolve everything, but for now, he needed my absolute silence and cooperation. I was stunned by my husband's strange demeanor. His solemn vow echoed in the small room, bouncing off the mildewed walls and back into my mind. A man who had always prioritized filial piety, who had always followed his parents' every word, was now vowing to protect me from his own family. His eyes held no trace of weakness or evasion. Instead, there was a sharp, cold glint of determination that was almost frightening, as if he were harboring some monumental plan. I stood quietly, letting him hold me. The warmth from his embrace seeped into my body, which was trembling from cold and anger. I wanted to believe him. I truly wanted to believe the man I had spent my youth loving and building a life with. But the wounds he had inflicted were still bleeding, making my faith a fragile, precarious thing. I let out a long, weary sigh, telling him my patience was gone. I would give him this one last chance, not out of weakness, but because I wanted to see just how much that trust he asked for was worth. Michael slowly stood up, wrapping his arms around me and pulling me into a hug. That night, in the darkness of the old apartment, we held each other, sleepless. A great storm was quietly gathering, preparing to sweep away the false order of the Miller family. The night in the Pilsen apartment complex passed heavily. The chirping of crickets outside mixed with the mournful sound of the winter wind whistling through the window cracks. I lay with my back to Michael, my eyes wide open in the darkness, my mind stretched taut. Michael's vow from earlier replayed endlessly in my thoughts. What was he planning? Why would he agree so easily to his parents' theft of our property, only to come home and beg for my trust? Dozens of questions swirled in my head, intertwined with the profound sorrow of losing the house we had worked so hard for. Beside me, Michael was also restless, his occasional heavy sighs breaking the silence. Neither of us spoke. We lay awake until the gray light of dawn seeped through the blinds. The next morning, I woke with a splitting headache and dark circles under my eyes. I dragged myself out of bed, brushed my teeth, and wheeled my old scooter out the door. Michael told me to be careful on my way to work and that he would cook dinner tonight. I gave a perfunctory nod and rode off into the bustling morning traffic. The biting cold did little to wake me. It only worsened my mood. I felt like a ghost, exhausted by schemes, weary of a marriage stained by opportunism. When I arrived at the university's Agricultural Research Institute, I trudged into the plant genetics department. The moment I walked in, I noticed a palpable excitement in the air, a stark contrast to the usual quiet focus. Sarah, the head of our department's social committee, quickly pulled me over to the coffee machine. Her face was flushed, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. She asked if I had heard the bombshell news that had just trickled down from the federal level. I shook my head, explaining that I'd been busy with family matters the night before and hadn't checked the internal announcements. Sarah clapped me on the shoulder, her eyes shining. The Department of Agriculture had just approved a massive, nation-level super project, the construction of a high-tech agricultural complex on the island of Puerto Rico. The project had the full backing of the government, with an enormous budget aimed at transforming the island not only into a tourist paradise, but also into a center for world-class organic agriculture. Our institute had been given the honor of selecting its top experts, its most brilliant scientists, to go there and build the project from the ground up. Sarah stressed that this was a once-in-a-lifetime career opportunity. The salary and benefits for the lead specialists were triple our current pay, and we would be given a luxury apartment near the beach. The only catch was a required commitment of 3 to 5 years, a complete relocation to the island. Hearing this, my heart skipped a beat. Puerto Rico. 3 to 5 years. A new land, thousands of miles away from Chicago, far from my scheming, materialistic in-laws. My mind began to race with audacious thoughts. If Michael and I were chosen for this project, we would be completely free from the clutches of Frank and Susan. We could build a new life, free from their bitter scolding and the burden of a blind, one-sided filial duty. Wasn't this the perfect escape for our marriage, now teetering on the brink of collapse? For the rest of the morning, I couldn't focus on my work. The promotion rumors danced in my head. I recalled Michael's determined eyes and mysterious vow from the night before. Could it be that he already knew about this? Given our outstanding performance and notable research over the past few years, it was highly likely that the Institute's board would consider us. A tiny spark of hope ignited in the darkness of my soul. I decided I had to ask Michael about it tonight. If he agreed to leave everything behind and start a new life with me, I would take his hand and go to the ends of the earth. But if he refused, unwilling to leave his family, then I would have my answer, and I would decide my own fate. The rare, bright sun of the winter afternoon faded behind the skyscrapers, giving way to the biting cold that began to grip every corner of Chicago. I left work a little earlier than usual, stopping by a local market to pick up some pork chops and green beans for a simple dinner. As I turned into the dim stairwell of our apartment building, I froze. A tall figure in a flashy, brand-name jacket was leaning against our door, a cigarette dangling from his lips, exhaling plumes of smoke. It was Kevin, my precious brother-in-law, the new heir to 3 valuable houses, blocking my doorway with an insolent look on his face. Seeing me approach with my grocery bags, Kevin contemptuously flicked his half-smoked cigarette onto the concrete floor and ground it out with the toe of his expensive shoe. He smirked, a condescending half-smile, and without a word of greeting, spoke in a mocking tone. He commented on how late I was getting home from work, saying that being a government-funded scientist for such a meager salary seemed like too much hard work. Maybe I should just quit and stay home. I shot him a sharp glare, not bothering to reply, and reached for my keys to open the door. But Kevin deliberately spread his arms, blocking the lock. I told him in a cold voice to get out of my way so I could make dinner. If he had something to say, he could wait for Michael to get home. Kevin chuckled, his face tilted towards the ceiling in arrogance. He then said something so shameless I couldn't believe my ears. He wasn't here for a social visit, he explained. He was here to talk big business. His parents had already transferred the titles of the 3 houses to him. The paperwork was done. He was the boss now. But the house we bought was outdated, and the retail space needed a complete renovation to become a showroom for agricultural supplies. He calculated that the repairs and initial inventory would cost around $50,000. I stood frozen, my hand clutching the keys. Kevin continued his outrageous speech. He said Michael was the older brother, the one who made good money and had connections at the research institute. Since their parents had given the assets to the younger brother, the older siblings had a responsibility to provide the startup capital. He demanded that we withdraw $50,000 from our savings account and lend it to him. He used the word lend, but quickly added that he would only pay it back when his business was profitable. If it failed, we could just consider it our contribution to helping him overcome his difficulties. Kevin's audacity left me speechless. It was ludicrous. The man who had just stolen the fruits of our labor now had the gall to show up at our shabby apartment to demand the last of our meager savings. That $50,000 was the money I had set aside for when we had a child, our emergency fund for sickness or trouble. It was money earned with our blood and tears, yet, in the eyes of this parasite, it was just a small sum that we were obligated to hand over to fulfill our family duty. I took a step back, staring at Kevin's smug face, a wave of nausea rising in my stomach. This man's greed knew no bounds of morality or decency. He saw our sacrifices as his due, our assets as a bottomless gold mine for him to exploit freely. Standing at my own front door, the rage I had suppressed since the night before erupted with renewed force. I was ready to unleash the most venomous words I could think of upon this shameless creature. My anger flared. I dropped my groceries, not caring as the green beans scattered across the dirty floor. I pointed a finger directly at Kevin's face, my eyes blazing as I shouted. I called him a shameless parasite, a strong, healthy man of 28 who, instead of working for a living, did nothing but leech off his family. I exposed him for what he was, telling him that those 3 houses were stolen from his brother and sister-in-law's sweat and tears. How could he swallow that without choking? And now have the nerve to ask for another $50,000. I declared that my money was for my future, not to be thrown into the bottomless pit of a lazy, worthless bum. My direct assault wiped the smirk off Kevin's face. His face flushed red, and his eyes bulged as he pointed back at me. The thuggish nature he usually kept hidden was now on full display. He gritted his teeth and began to curse me out, calling me a bitter, petty woman who dared to lecture her brother-in-law. He used the most degrading terms to insult me. Kevin said I was just an outsider who had married into the family, a guest in the Miller house who was dependent on his parents' generosity. He stated that, in this family, my voice was worthless. The Miller family's wealth was for the Millers to enjoy, and I had no right to complain. The word guest was like a knife to my bleeding heart. For 5 years, I had poured my heart and soul into this family, only to be seen as a stranger, a temporary resident to be exploited. Just as our argument reached its peak, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed up the stairs. Michael appeared, briefcase in hand, his face weary. Seeing my husband, I expected him to fly into a rage, to defend the wife who was being insulted by his own brother. I looked at him with desperate hope, but once again, Michael disappointed me profoundly. He stepped between me and Kevin, but instead of slapping his insolent brother, or at least yelling at him to apologize, he turned and gently patted Kevin on the shoulder. He told Kevin to cool down, that there was no need to shout, and let the neighbors hear. Michael told Kevin to go home and rest, that he had heard about the $50,000. He would think about it tonight and give an official answer to him and their parents tomorrow. Hearing this, Kevin looked triumphant. He shot me a provocative glare, brushed off his jacket, and swaggered down the stairs, tossing a final threat over his shoulder. If they didn't have the money tomorrow, he wouldn't be so respectful of family ties. After Kevin was gone, Michael turned to me, reaching out to touch my shoulder, but I slapped his hand away and retreated to a corner. My endurance had finally hit rock bottom. His promise to give an answer tomorrow meant he was actually considering handing over the last of our savings. He had just stood by and let someone call his wife a guest. I pushed past Michael and stormed into the apartment, throwing open the closet door. I dragged our old suitcase out from under the bed, tossed it onto the mattress, and began frantically stuffing my clothes and personal belongings inside. Michael rushed after me in a panic, grabbing my hands. He asked what kind of crazy stunt I was pulling. I struggled to break free, screaming in despair. I told him I was sick of his play acting as the dutiful son. I refused to live with a coward who couldn't even protect his own wife. I announced, loud and clear, that we were finished. Tomorrow, I would file for divorce. I didn't want any of our assets. I would go be a guest somewhere else and leave the stage for his family to continue their performance. The sound of the suitcase zipper being yanked shut was a shrill, final severing of the ties between two people who had once shared a life. In the midst of my struggle with Michael over the half-packed suitcase, the phone in my handbag, tossed on the sofa, began to ring, a sharp, insistent series of chimes. The default ringtone, so ordinary on any other day, now sounded like a piercing alarm. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed 2 large words, Frank Miller. I was about to hit the power button to cut off all contact with that toxic family, but Michael swiftly snatched the phone. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he switched it to speakerphone and placed it on the glass coffee table. He looked at me, signaling for me to be quiet. I frowned, confused, but crossed my arms and waited to see what would happen next. The ringing stopped, and Frank's booming, furious voice filled the small room. Without any preamble, he unleashed a hailstorm of verbal abuse on me. He roared into the phone, demanding to know what disrespectful stunt I had pulled to make Kevin come home crying. He said Kevin had just reported that not only had we refused to lend him money, but I, his sister-in-law, had stood in the doorway, calling him a useless parasite and trying to kick him out. Frank's voice grew shriller, revealing the deep-seated dictatorial nature that was part of his very being. He insulted my upbringing, saying his family was cursed to have such a vile, petty daughter-in-law who knew no respect. He blamed me for everything, accusing me of being the instigator, the one pulling the strings and causing division in his family. He declared that the Miller family's assets and affairs were none of the business of an outsider daughter-in-law. And then, he delivered the most cruel and venomous threat. In the tone of a king issuing a decree to a servant, Frank commanded me to get ready immediately and take a taxi to their house in Lincoln Park tonight. He demanded that I kneel in the middle of the living room and kowtow to Kevin as an apology for my insolence. He added a final, devastating ultimatum. If I was not at their house, on my knees, within the hour, he would force Michael to file for divorce immediately. He would have me thrown out with nothing, not a single thing belonging to the Miller family. He would rather his son be divorced than have the family's authority challenged. The vicious words coming from the small speaker were devastating, completely shattering the last vestiges of respect I had for my elders. I stood there, my face ashen, my eyes wide as I stared at the phone. I couldn't even cry anymore. The pain had frozen over, transforming into pure, unadulterated contempt. I realized that trying to be a good daughter-in-law in this family was the most futile and pathetic effort of my life. The call ended abruptly, leaving a series of sharp, jarring beeps in the silence. I gave a small, bitter smile, a smile of both agony and release. I slowly bent down, shoved my last jacket into the suitcase, and zipped it shut decisively. I looked at Michael, the man who had just witnessed his own father verbally abuse and humiliate his wife. I didn't have the energy for another word of blame. This humiliation was more than enough to be the final chapter. I grabbed the handle of the suitcase, ready to walk out that door, leaving behind a dead marriage and a husband who could only stand silently in the face of his family's tyranny. The phone lay silent on the glass table, but the echo of my father-in-law's toxic words hung in the oppressive air of the apartment. I stood staring at the open suitcase, its contents a jumbled mess of clothes, a perfect reflection of the chaos in my mind. I took a deep breath, forcing the humiliation down. I zipped the suitcase with a final, decisive tug. The sound of metal on metal was a shrill final cut, severing the fragile family ties I had tried to maintain for 5 long years. I turned to Michael. He stood motionless, his face half hidden in the shadows cast by the streetlights outside. I braced myself for his usual speech. He would gently advise me to be patient, or worse, he would yell and force me into a taxi to go apologize to his brother. I was ready to fight back, ready to sign the divorce papers and free myself. But contrary to all my expectations, Michael said nothing about calming me down. He walked over to the coat rack, pulled on his own windbreaker, his movements slow but deliberate. Then, he came to me, bent down, and lifted the heavy suitcase. He looked directly into my eyes. There was no evasion, no fear as there usually was. His gaze was deep, steady, and held a mysterious fire I had never seen before. In a strangely calm voice, Michael spoke. He said that since his father had called us back, we would go back. His brief statement stunned me, and my anger flared anew. I grabbed for the suitcase handle, demanding to know what game he was playing. I told him there was no way I was setting foot in that house to kneel before an uneducated lout like Kevin. If he wanted to go be the dutiful son, the benevolent brother, he could take the suitcase and go by himself. I would find a hotel for the night and be at the courthouse first thing in the morning to file for divorce. I would not endure this humiliation for another second. Michael didn't let go of the suitcase. With his free hand, he gripped my trembling shoulders. His grasp was firm, sending a strange warmth through me. He lowered his voice, his tone becoming incredibly serious and urgent. He reminded me of his vow from the previous night, telling me to remember what he had said, to give him one last chance, and to trust him completely. He insisted that this trip home tonight was not for me to kneel in apology, but to end all of our grievances, once and for all. He gave me his word of honor. If I would just cooperate, remain silent, and go with him, then after tonight, whatever I decided about our marriage, he would accept completely. The resolution in his voice made me pause. A wife's intuition told me that the man standing before me was no longer the weak-willed husband who always bowed to his parents. A bold and daring plan seemed to be unfolding in his mind. I stared at him, searching for any hint of deceit in his eyes, but found none, only the calm stillness of a lake before a great storm. In the end, curiosity and the faint embers of our shared life won out over my rage. I released my grip on the suitcase and gave a cold nod. I told him to lead the way. I would follow to see what kind of play he intended to stage. Michael let out a quiet sigh of relief. He carried the suitcase out into the dark hallway. Together, we descended the cold concrete steps of the apartment building. The winter wind howled outside, whipping at my face and forcing me to pull my collar up. Michael opened the car door, carefully placed the suitcase in the back, and got into the driver's seat. I sat beside him, my arms crossed, staring blankly into the night. The engine started, and the car slowly pulled away from the bustling Pilsen Street, heading straight for Lincoln Park. In the confined space of the car, neither of us spoke. The hum of the engine mixed with the frantic beating of my heart. This journey felt like a drive to my own execution, where the final sentence on my marriage and my relationship with the Miller family was about to be pronounced. The car turned onto the familiar, wide street in Lincoln Park and slowed to a stop in front of my in-laws' house. The large, bronze-colored iron gate, usually shut tight at this hour, was wide open, as if waiting to devour anyone who entered. The harsh white light from the living room fluorescent bulbs spilled out onto the patio, illuminating every pristine paving stone. I stepped out of the car, a gust of wind making me shiver. The frigid air seemed to amplify the ice in my heart. Michael walked ahead, carrying the suitcase, and I followed closely behind him. Each step onto that familiar patio brought back bitter memories. This was where I had carried groceries to cook lavish feasts for their relatives. This was where I had painstakingly swept and cleaned until I was exhausted before every holiday. And now, I was entering this house as a criminal about to face judgment. We stepped into the living room. The spacious room was dominated by a heavy, ornate mahogany furniture set, intricately carved with dragons and phoenixes, a set I had paid for with my own year-end project bonus to help my father-in-law show off to his friends. And right now, on the most commanding armchair in the center of the room, sat Frank. His face was red, his eyebrows fiercely knitted together. He was dressed in silk pajamas, holding a cup of strong tea, looking every bit the judge awaiting a sinner's prostration. Beside him, my mother-in-law, Susan, sat chewing her gum with a smacking sound. She wore a velvet housecoat, her sharp eyes raking over me as if to tear my coat off. A smug, mocking half-smile played on her lips, but the true focus of my disgust was on the long sofa opposite them. Kevin was there, his legs crossed, leaning back arrogantly. He was scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing up at me with a look of pure provocation. His smug face radiated the satisfaction of a man who had won a total victory. He was certain that under his parents' pressure, his older brother and I, no matter how stubborn, would have to come crawling with money and beg for forgiveness. The air in the living room was so still and oppressive that I could hear the ticking of the gilded grandfather clock on the wall. Seeing us enter, Frank slammed his teacup down on the glass table. The sharp sound broke the silence. He cleared his throat and glared at me, his voice dripping with authority and contempt. He demanded to know if I understood my crime. Now that I was here, why was I just standing there? Did I not know to get on my knees and beg my brother-in-law for forgiveness immediately? He threatened that if I didn't do as he said, he would make Michael write up the divorce papers and throw me out of the Miller family tonight. Susan chimed in, adding that other people's daughters-in-law were gentle and obedient, always looking out for their husband's family, while I was selfish and petty, jealous of my husband's own brother. Her voice was shrill as she lamented how unlucky her family was to have such an ill-bred daughter-in-law. Seeing his parents championing him, Kevin grew bolder. He put his phone down and jutted his chin out. He told me to hurry up and apologize so he could go to bed. His time was money now. He didn't have all night to argue with a freeloader. The humiliation was blatant, happening right before my eyes. Hot blood rushed to my head. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. I held my head high, my eyes burning with hatred as I looked at the three of them. I was about to open my mouth to fight back, to throw my contempt in their faces and declare our divorce on the spot. I didn't need this rotten family anymore. But just as my lips began to move, Michael stepped forward. He extended his arm, blocking me from their view. His solid shoulder obscured Frank's line of sight, effectively halting my outburst. In a completely unexpected move, Michael placed the suitcase on the floor and bowed his head respectfully to his parents. The entire script I had imagined in my head was completely overturned. I stood frozen behind Michael, staring in disbelief at his actions. He was bowing his head, a gesture of submission and surrender to the tyranny of his own parents. A wave of overwhelming disappointment washed over me. I had thought he brought me here to reason with them, to protect me. It turned out he had brought me here to take the blame himself, to continue playing the role of the blindly obedient, dutiful son. Michael began to speak, his voice steady, calm, and filled with a perfectly feigned remorse. He told his parents that the conflict tonight was entirely his fault. He took responsibility for not guiding his wife properly, for allowing her to speak rashly to her younger brother. He asked his parents to calm down, not to hold a grudge against a woman for her simple-mindedness, lest it affect their health. Then, Michael turned to Kevin and gave a slight nod. He said that Kevin, being the younger brother, was naturally impulsive, and his coming to our apartment was just out of anxiety for his new business venture. He continued, saying that as the older brother, he couldn't stand by while his younger brother faced difficulties. He had given serious thought to Kevin's need for startup capital. With that, Michael reached into the black briefcase he always carried. Every eye in the room was fixed on his movements. Frank, Susan, and Kevin all held their breath. From the briefcase, Michael pulled out a thick stack of documents neatly enclosed in a clear plastic sleeve. He placed it gently on the glass table in front of Kevin. Michael announced clearly, stating that this was a 5-year commercial lease agreement for a prime retail space in one of the busiest, most upscale shopping centers in the city. He explained that while our family's other property was large, its location wasn't ideal for a major agricultural supply showroom. Therefore, he had used his connections to find and secure this lease for Kevin. The contract was already drafted with the most favorable terms, just waiting for Kevin to sign and take possession. Furthermore, regarding the $50,000 Kevin had requested, he gave his firm promise that he would arrange for the full amount to be transferred directly into Kevin's account for inventory and startup costs. Michael's declaration was like a bombshell of cash and gold exploding in the living room. The silence was instantly replaced by unadulterated joy. Kevin lunged forward like a starving animal pouncing on prey. He snatched the documents, his eyes shining as he flipped through the pages, a grin splitting his face from ear to ear. He marveled at the prime location. Susan was so overjoyed she dropped her piece of gum onto her housecoat. She beamed, rushing over to pat Michael's back, praising him endlessly as the true heir of the family, a responsible man who shouldered the family's burdens. She shot me a triumphant glare, as if to prove that the Miller family's power could crush any resistance I might offer. Frank stroked his chin, the furious red of his face softening into a look of deep satisfaction and pride. He nodded repeatedly, murmuring his approval of Michael's decisive action. This, he said, was how a man should handle business. Helping one's own flesh and blood was never a loss. He had completely forgotten his demand for me to kneel and apologize. All his attention was now focused on his darling son's new business empire. In stark contrast to my in-laws' ecstatic celebration, I stood rooted to the spot, feeling the world crumble around me. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The word despair wasn't strong enough to describe my feelings. My husband, the man who just last night had knelt and sworn to protect me, had now single-handedly offered up our entire life savings to his family. $50,000, plus the astronomical rent for a prime commercial space for 5 years. It was a colossal sum that we could work our entire lives and never pay off. Michael had completely lost his mind. He had sold me out, sold out our small family, in exchange for empty praise from a pack of greedy vultures. Tears welled in my eyes, a bitter, humiliating sorrow choking me. I wanted to scream, to tear that damned contract to shreds, but my legs were numb, unable to move. The living room was filled with boisterous laughter. Kevin talked nonstop about his business plans, already calculating which new luxury car he would buy once the profits started rolling in. Susan was already planning the grand opening, talking about finding a matchmaker to set Kevin up with a wealthy heiress. Frank smiled contentedly, sipping his tea like a patriarch reaping the rewards of his lineage. I took a step back, leaning against the wall to keep from collapsing. I squeezed my eyes shut, unwilling to look at their gloating, grotesque faces anymore. It was truly over. The faint hope I had for a husband who knew right from wrong had been brutally extinguished. I told myself that the first thing I would do tomorrow morning was print the divorce papers and deliver them to his office to end this tragedy. At the peak of their jubilation, Michael cleared his throat. It was a soft sound, but it was enough to capture everyone's attention. He waited for Susan's laughter to die down before he spoke again slowly. He told his parents and Kevin to be patient. He had one more important matter to announce. The mood shifted slightly as everyone turned to him with curiosity. Kevin, still clutching the lease agreement, assumed his brother was about to produce the $50,000 on the spot. Michael reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out 2 crisp, flat sheets of paper. Unlike the black and white contract, these papers bore the official, full-color seal of the United States Department of Agriculture. Michael carefully placed the 2 documents on the glass table next to Frank's teacup. He stood up straight, took a deep breath, and declared in a clear, formal tone. He announced that these were high-level personnel appointment orders, issued directly from the department. As per the leadership's assignment, he and I had been selected as the project lead and deputy lead for the national-level high-tech agriculture initiative. The location of our new assignment was not in the Midwest, but on the remote island of Puerto Rico. Michael's voice echoed with clarity. He went on to explain that this was a critical project requiring experts to be on-site continuously. Due to the urgent nature of the work, he and I would have to pack our belongings and fly south next week. The assignment would last for a minimum of 3 to 5 years, possibly longer if the project expanded. During that time, the research would be intense and confidential. They would have almost no time to return to Chicago or be involved in any family matters here. The room fell deathly silent. The ticking of the clock on the wall was suddenly deafening. Michael's announcement was a devastating counterstrike, wiping the smug smiles off the faces of the 3 people opposite him. My eyes flew open. I felt a wave of dizziness, my heart pounding in my chest. The rumor I had heard at the Institute that morning was true. And the craziest part was that Michael had secretly finalized all the arrangements, securing this precious opportunity for both of us without my knowledge. My astonishment quickly gave way to an indescribable sense of relief and elation. It turned out he had planned every step. This move to Puerto Rico was the golden key, the door to freedom that would save us from the corrosive influence of this family. I looked up at my husband's broad back, and tears streamed down my face again. But this time, they were not tears of anger, but of overwhelming emotion. The earlier joy had completely evaporated from the room, replaced by a thick, tense atmosphere of shock. My in-laws and Kevin looked as if they had been doused with ice water. They stared at the 2 official-looking documents on the table, their minds scrambling to process the enormous implications of what Michael had just said. Kevin was the first to react. He dropped the lease agreement, shot to his feet, his face drained of all color. He stammered, asking Michael in a panic, if they were disappearing to Puerto Rico for years, who was going to pay the monthly rent on the commercial space? Who was going to transfer him the $50,000? The business empire he had imagined for all of 5 minutes was already threatening to crumble into dust. Michael looked at Kevin, his expression serene, and replied with irrefutable logic. He explained that their work there would be incredibly demanding, and the research facility was isolated, with limited phone and internet access. Transferring money and handling logistics would be very difficult. He said he had provided the lease documents. Kevin could handle the transaction himself. As for the $50,000, they needed to manage their finances for their new life in the South, but they would try to arrange for it to be sent later, once they were settled. He used the words "arrange for it later" with a deliberate vagueness, like a promise written on the wind. Frank, now snapping out of his shock, furrowed his brow. He realized a truth far more bitter than a delay in Kevin's $50,000. If his eldest son and his wife left for good, it meant the monthly financial support that covered his living expenses, family obligations, and medical bills would be completely cut off. The cash cow they had milked relentlessly for 5 years was officially leaving the farm. His regret and thwarted greed morphed into a towering rage. Frank slammed his hand on the table, sending the tea set clattering. He pointed a finger at Michael, his voice raw as he spewed the vilest insults. He called Michael an ungrateful son, whom he had raised and educated only to have him abandon his family responsibilities. He accused Michael of using his career as an excuse to escape his duty of caring for his aging parents and supporting his brother. He roared that if Michael set foot out of this house to go south, he should never show his face here again. He would consider himself without a son. Susan began to wail, slapping her thighs dramatically. She cried that her children were all grown up and flying away, leaving 2 old, withered parents with no one to care for them. She shot me a venomous look, calling me a siren who had bewitched her husband into abandoning his home and family. Faced with his family's tirade, Michael stood as immovable as a stone statue. He didn't explain, didn't argue, and showed no fear or hesitation. He waited for Frank to finish his rant, then gave a slight, formal bow. In the coldest, most resolute voice I had ever heard him use, Michael replied with a single word: yes. He acknowledged his parents' words and stated his intent to fulfill the duties assigned to him by the nation. He then advised Kevin that now, with 3 houses in his possession, the family's greatest assets were his. Therefore, the primary responsibility for caring for their parents now fell on his shoulders, in place of the brother who would be far away. With that, Michael turned decisively, walked over to me, and took my cold hand in his. His hand was surprisingly warm and steady. With his other hand, he picked up the suitcase. Together, we walked out of the living room, leaving behind the sounds of screaming, cursing, and my mother-in-law's crocodile tears. Our silhouettes stretched long across the patio under the cold, bright lights. The iron gate slammed shut behind us, a final, permanent end to the years of tragedy, tears, and exploitation at the Miller house. We walked away, heads held high, our hearts light, ready to embrace the new horizon that awaited us. The old sedan pulled away from the wide street in Lincoln Park, leaving behind the brightly lit house and the chaotic sounds of a family drowning in its own greed. I leaned back against the passenger seat, my body exhausted as if I had just recovered from a long illness. The winter wind still howled outside, but inside the car, the silence was profound. I turned to look at Michael. His hands were steady on the wheel, his angular face pointed straight ahead, his eyes filled with a strange mix of determination and peace. As we reached a quiet stretch of road alongside Lake Michigan, Michael pulled over and turned off the engine. It was dark, with only the dim streetlights casting a soft glow on the car's hood. Michael unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to face me. He looked at me with an incredibly gentle expression, one filled with a deep love and gratitude that I hadn't seen in a very long time. Suddenly, he reached out and pulled me into a hug, a tight, strong, and warm embrace. I buried my face in his chest, hearing the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. Tears I didn't know I had left began to fall, soaking a patch of his jacket. These were not tears of anger or humiliation like the night before, but tears of release, of overwhelming happiness at the realization that my husband was not a coward. Michael gently stroked my hair, his voice low and full of sympathy. He told me to cry, to let out all the pain and frustration of the past years. From tomorrow, he whispered, we would start over in a new place, where no one could ever hurt his wife again. I looked up at him, my voice still choked with emotion, and asked him about everything that had just happened. I asked about the lease agreement, the $50,000 he had promised Kevin, and the 3 houses he had so easily surrendered. Michael smiled. A rare, cunning smile on the face of a serious scientist. He wiped the tears from my cheeks and began to reveal the truth behind the perfect play he had staged. He told me that the lease agreement was completely worthless, a fake mock-up created by a friend of his in real estate. The stamps and seals were clever forgeries, designed to fool people blinded by greed, like Kevin and his parents. There was no retail space waiting for Kevin, and certainly no agricultural supply business. He had given it to Kevin only to create an illusion of wealth, a distraction to keep them from obstructing our departure. I stared at him, my jaw agape. I asked about the $50,000. Michael stated firmly that the money was our blood, sweat, and tears, the result of years of scrimping and saving. He would never be foolish enough to hand it over to a lazy, ungrateful freeloader. The promise to transfer the money was just a stalling tactic, a way to appease Frank and Kevin while we made our escape. Once we were in Puerto Rico, the distance and the confidential nature of our work would be an impenetrable fortress against any further demands from home. But the most shocking and brilliant revelation was the truth about the 3 houses. I asked him why he had silently agreed to give up the house we had poured everything into. Michael sighed, his eyes turning sharp and cold. He explained that his silence and compliance over the past few days were a calculated move to completely sever the enormous financial burden his family had become. The 3rd house, the one we had paid for, was legally in Frank's name, and Frank, Michael had discovered, had secretly taken out massive mortgages on all 3 properties to fund a series of failed online investment schemes. He was deeply in debt. When Frank transferred the titles of the properties to Kevin, according to the law, he also transferred the full responsibility for the enormous debt. Michael had known about his parents' plan to eventually push this ticking time bomb of debt onto us, the responsible older son and his wife. So he chose to take one step back, to happily cede all the assets and the crushing debt that came with them to Kevin. Now, his precious little brother would have to break his own back to pay the mortgages on 3 houses, with no foolish older brother to bail him out. Hearing Michael's entire plan, I felt a shiver run down my spine. This incredible reversal, this profound punishment, was a masterstroke against the bottomless greed of the Miller family. I threw my arms around Michael's neck and laughed, a loud, joyous laugh of pure relief. The immense weight that had been crushing my chest for 5 years had vanished. My husband wasn't a coward. He had been using his silence to weave a perfect net to protect our small family from the cruel parasitism of those who called themselves our relatives. In the quiet peace by the lake, we shared a passionate kiss, officially casting off our chains and preparing to fly toward a brilliant future. After that fateful night, we plunged into a race against time to prepare for our move. We had exactly 1 week to finalize the handover of our work at the Institute in Chicago and clear out our old apartment in Pilsen. The small apartment was now a chaotic landscape of cardboard boxes filled with books, research notes, and clothes. Despite the exhaustion from long days and short nights, both Michael and I felt a boundless energy. The joy of our impending escape made every hardship feel weightless. We planned to return the apartment to the landlord, sell off all our bulky furniture, and take only our most important belongings and our entire savings to start our new life in Puerto Rico. On the 5th day after our confrontation with the Millers, I was sealing the last box of documents when my phone, sitting on the dresser, rang. I saw Susan Miller flashing on the screen. My heart gave a familiar, reflexive clench, but I immediately calmed myself. I was no longer the submissive daughter-in-law who trembled at her mother-in-law's call. I picked up the phone and took it to Michael, who was sorting through a list of seed samples. Michael took the phone, didn't bother with the speaker, and answered. His face an emotionless mask. A chaotic torrent of sound erupted from the other end, the sound of desperate sobbing, things being smashed, and Susan's hysterical screams. She was crying like a madwoman, calling Michael's name in a panic. She delivered devastating news. Frank had just been rushed to the hospital in critical condition. A sudden, massive spike in his blood pressure had caused him to collapse, foaming at the mouth and completely unconscious. The cause of this catastrophic stroke was none other than the darling son they had sacrificed everything to protect. Sobbing, Susan recounted the story in broken, desperate gasps. That morning, Kevin, dressed in a borrowed designer suit, had swaggered into the management office of the upscale shopping center with the fake lease agreement, demanding to be given his retail space. When the staff checked their records and informed him the contract was fraudulent, Kevin, true to his arrogant and thuggish nature, began screaming and causing a scene, insisting he was a major tenant being cheated. The result was that security was called. They forcibly restrained him, dragged him out of the building, and threw him onto the street. He even got a few punches for resisting, leaving his face bruised and swollen. Kevin had limped home, wailing to his parents and accusing Michael of setting him up. At the same time, a debt collector from the bank arrived to serve notice on the overdue interest payments for the massive mortgage tied to the 3 properties. They demanded that the new owner, Kevin Miller, immediately pay the arrears, which amounted to tens of thousands of dollars, or they would begin foreclosure proceedings. The truth was laid bare with brutal finality. All of Kevin's dreams of a business empire vanished. Frank realized he had been tricked by the son he had always exploited, and that his precious younger son was utterly incapable of handling the colossal debt. The immense shock and rage were too much for him, leading to the stroke. Susan begged Michael to come to the hospital immediately, to bring money to pay the medical bills and to sort things out with the bank for Kevin. She wailed that the family was in ruins, and only Michael could save them. I stood beside Michael, hearing every word of my mother-in-law's desperate plea. A complex mix of pity for their foolishness and a chilling sense of karmic justice washed over me. The price for their actions had come swiftly and cruelly. Michael stood motionless, his expression unchanged. He waited for Susan to exhaust her crying and pleading before he finally spoke. His voice was as cold and hard as stone. He informed his mother that he and I had a flight to Puerto Rico the next day to begin our national assignment. All travel arrangements were finalized and could not be changed. He reminded her of his statement from the other night. The 3 houses and all the family's most valuable assets had been given to Kevin. Therefore, it was Kevin's responsibility to pay for his father's medical bills and to deal with the bank debt that he had so happily signed for. Michael stated that his own responsibility had ended. He was no longer obligated to clean up the mess their greed had created. With that, Michael decisively ended the call and powered off his phone, severing the last line of communication with his past. He turned to me, a small, relieved smile on his face, and went back to packing, preparing for a new life free from the shadows of selfish people. The flight from Chicago landed at San Juan's International Airport, carrying 2 people who had just made a spectacular escape from the prison of their own family. Stepping out of the terminal, the warm, humid air, tinged with the salt of the sea, washed over us, chasing away the bone-deep chill of the northern winter. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling freedom flow through me. The sky above was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a perfect mirror of our spirits. All the anxiety, schemes, and bitter tears were left behind in Chicago. We carried only a single suitcase and hearts burning with a desire to build something new. A car from the project management team picked us up and drove us to a housing complex for senior specialists, situated on a gentle hill overlooking the deep blue expanse of the ocean. When the door to our apartment opened, I was stunned by its spaciousness and modern amenities. A world away from the musty, decaying apartment in Pilsen, this was a sleek, beautifully furnished home with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the sea. The breezy balcony was overflowing with vibrant bougainvillea. Michael wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. He whispered that this was our real home now. A place with no scolding, no unreasonable demands, only love and mutual respect. The very next day, we threw ourselves into our work with an intensity that was fueled by passion and happiness. The 100-hectare high-tech agricultural complex was in its early stages. As the project leads, Michael and I were in charge of developing salt-tolerant crop strains and designing an AI-controlled greenhouse system. Our days in Puerto Rico were a whirlwind of professional activity. In the mornings, we'd put on our white lab coats and head out to the experimental fields under the bright tropical sun. In the evenings, we'd be back in the lab, analyzing soil samples and recording data. Our careers flourished, no longer distracted by calls for money or tension-filled family dinners. Our talents were finally unleashed. The first salt-tolerant rice varieties we developed yielded harvests that exceeded all expectations, earning us a personal letter of commendation from the Secretary of Agriculture and a substantial bonus. The younger scientists at the project looked up to Michael as a mentor, and I became a respected expert in my field. We used our bonuses and high salaries to furnish our home. On weekends, we would ride a scooter along the coast, watching the sunset and eating fresh seafood. The simple, joyful, and independent life I had always dreamed of was now a reality. Our happiness became complete one autumn morning, exactly a year after we arrived on the island. While checking soil pH levels in a greenhouse, I suddenly felt dizzy, and a wave of nausea forced me to my knees. Michael, seeing my distress, dropped his papers and carried me to the on-site clinic. The old doctor, after running a few tests, emerged with a beaming smile and announced the news we had been hoping for since we were first married. I was 6 weeks pregnant. Hearing the news, Michael cried like a child. He knelt by my bed, pressing his face to my stomach, his tears of joy mixing with my own. This child was coming at the perfect time, after we had completely shed the shadows of our past and stood strong on our own 2 feet. In the following months, Michael doted on me. He took over all the strenuous chores, cooked nutritious meals, and spent hours talking to the little life growing inside me. In our apartment overlooking the sea, laughter was a constant sound. We were painting a bright future, one where our child would be born and raised in an environment of freedom, love, and genuine kindness, completely immune to the poison of bottomless greed. Time in Puerto Rico flew by. It was nearly 3 years since we had left Chicago. Our son, Ben, was now a sturdy, clever 2-year-old, just learning to run, a miniature version of his father. Our careers continued to reach new heights, cementing our reputations as leading national experts. Our blissful life unfolded peacefully to the rhythm of the ocean waves, until one evening, when devastating news from home arrived. Michael came home late from a project meeting, his face somber, holding a worn envelope that had come in the mail. He told me it was from a distant relative in Chicago, writing to update us on the situation with Frank and Susan. I held Ben close as Michael opened the letter. The words inside painted a tragic picture of the collapse of a once arrogant family. After being thrown out of the shopping center, Kevin had spiraled into a life of ruin. With no money from us and burdened by the massive mortgage debt on the 3 houses, he was helpless. Instead of working to pay it off, he turned to gambling and, eventually, hard drugs. The inevitable outcome arrived. The bank foreclosed on all 3 properties. The Miller family lost everything and was forced to move into a single, squalid room in a rundown part of the city. Frank had survived his stroke, but was left paralyzed on his left side, completely bedridden. The bitterness of losing his fortune, the pain of his illness, and his powerlessness over his delinquent son had turned him into a cantankerous shell of a man who did nothing but curse his fate. Kevin, cornered by debt collectors and loan sharks, had hit rock bottom. In a desperate moment, he went home to steal the last of his mother's meager savings for a fix. Frank, seeing this, tried to beat him with his cane. In a drug-fueled rage, Kevin shoved his father to the ground, snatched the money, and fled, his whereabouts unknown. He left his 2 frail, elderly parents alone in their dilapidated room. Tucked inside, the letter was a smaller, tear-stained note in Susan's shaky handwriting. She pleaded for our forgiveness, begging us to have mercy, and returned to Chicago to save what was left of their shattered family. She cried that Frank was starving, that she was too old and weak to collect cans to survive. She begged her eldest son to come home and save his parents. Reading those tear-soaked words, I was stunned. A cold shiver ran through me. The universe has a way of balancing the scales. The greed and injustice they had inflicted upon us had borne the bitterest fruit, which they were now forced to eat alone. I looked at Michael, waiting for his reaction. His hand trembled slightly, and his eyes were red. After all, these were the people who had given him life. But his soft heart could not overcome the logic of a man who had been trampled on for too long. Michael took a deep breath, folded Susan's desperate plea, and tore it into tiny pieces. He threw the scraps into the trash, his face hardening into a look of cold resolve. He told me that there was no turning back on the path we had chosen. The price his family was paying was a consequence of their own actions. He would not allow our lives, and the life of our son, to be dragged back into that filthy mire. Yet, deep in his heart, a sliver of human decency remained. He would not go back, but he could not let his parents starve. That evening, Michael made a quiet call to a trusted friend in Chicago. He asked this friend to act as an anonymous intermediary, wiring $1,000 from his account each month to hire a professional caregiver for Frank and Susan. The money was enough to ensure they had basic food, shelter, and medicine until the end of their days. It was the absolute final limit of the filial duty Michael was willing to extend, a cold, impersonal, but necessary provision that would allow his conscience to be clear. I hugged him from behind, supporting his humane yet resolute decision. The final obligation had been met. The door to the past was now secured with a final, unbreakable lock. 5 years after leaving Chicago, the agricultural project in Puerto Rico that we led was a monumental success, earning acclaim both domestically and internationally. The once barren land was now covered with lush, green fields of salt-tolerant rice and automated greenhouses, making the island a leading supplier of organic produce. Our contributions were recognized by the government. The National Research Institute decided that we should return to the capital to accept a prestigious state award on behalf of the entire project team for our outstanding contributions to science. The Puerto Rican sun shone brightly that morning. I wore an elegant silk dress, my face glowing with the radiance of a successful and happy woman. Michael was in a sharp suit, looking more confident and mature than the thin, worn-out scientist of 5 years ago. Ben, now 5, was dressed in a smart little shirt, running around our feet with a toy airplane. Our happy family of 3 drew admiring glances from other travelers in the airport lounge. As we sat in the first-class lounge waiting to board, Michael's phone buzzed with a text message. I watched as his face froze for a moment, his eyes lingering on the short message. It was from our contact in Chicago, the person who managed the monthly payments for his parents' care. The message was brief, but carried the weight of a lifetime. Susan had passed away in her sleep early that morning after a long illness. Frank, who had completely lost his memory, had been moved by local authorities to a state-run nursing home. I gently took Michael's hand, offering silent support. I waited to see what he would do. This was his last chance to return and fulfill his duty as a son, to arrange his mother's funeral. No matter how painful the past, a final farewell was a sacred duty. If he wanted to change our flight, I would stand by him. Michael looked at the message for another long moment. Not a single tear fell. His face was a mask of utter tranquility, the stillness of complete release. Then, his thumb moved across the screen. He deleted the message. Then he deleted the contact's number from his phone. His movements were swift and light, like brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. Michael turned to me, his eyes clear and warm. He smiled, the brightest smile I had ever seen, and whispered in my ear. He said that for him, the debts and grievances of this world were now fully settled. He had paid his dues as a son, down to the last penny. From now on, his only family, the only thing that mattered, was me and Ben. The painful past, the cruel exploitation, the bitter insults, all of it was buried forever with the passing of those greedy souls. Just then, the airport announcer called for passengers on the flight to Chicago to proceed to the gate. Michael put his phone away, stood up, and stretched. He took my hand in one of his and, with the other, swung a giggling Ben up onto his shoulders. Our son pointed his toy airplane forward, ready for takeoff. Together, We walked toward the gate. The bright sunlight streamed through the airport's glass walls, bathing the three of us in a golden glow. Outside, a vast, clear blue sky opened up to an endless horizon. We were returning to the place that had once been our darkest hell, but this time, we returned as victors, heads held high to receive our honors, leaving the storms of the past behind us forever as we walked toward a future of endless light and peace.